"At Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," said Joe crossly. "It's so awful to be poor," agreed Meg, looking at her old dress. "It's not right for some girls to have pretty things and others to have nothing at all," said little Amy. "We've got Father and Mother and each other," said Beth gently. The four young faces round the fire cheered up as they thought of this, but then Joe said sadly, "We haven't got Father, and we won't have him for a long time." She didn't say perhaps never, but each silently thought it, remembering that he was away at the war in the South. Then Meg said, "Mother says we shouldn't spend money on presents when our men are fighting a war." "We can't expect anything from Mother or each other," said Joe, "but we only have $1 each, and that won't help the army much. Let's each buy ourselves what we want, and have a little fun. We work hard to earn it." "I do, teaching those awful children," said Meg. "I wish we had the money Father lost when we were little, Joe," said Meg. "I wish I was a boy," said Joe. "Then I could go and fight beside Father." Meg was 16 and very pretty, with large eyes and soft brown hair, and white hands. 15-year-old Joe was very tall and thin. Her long, dark red hair was usually pushed up out of the way. "What about me?" said Joe. "I'm shut up all day working for a terrible old lady, who gives me different orders every 5 seconds. I think washing cups and plates and keeping things tidy is the worst work in the world," said Beth. "My hands get too tired to play my music. I have to go to school with girls who laugh at my dresses and say cruel things because my father isn't rich," said Amy. Beth was 13, a very shy girl who seemed to live in a happy world of her own. Amy was the youngest, but thought herself to be the most important. She had blue eyes and yellow hair which curled onto her shoulders. At 6 o'clock, Beth put a pair of slippers by the fire to warm, and Meg lit the lamp. Amy got out of the comfortable chair without being asked, and Joe forgot how tired she was and held the slippers closer to the fire. "These are old," she said. "Mother needs a new pair." "I'll get her some with my $1, said Beth. "No, I shall," cried Amy. "I'm the oldest," began Meg. "I'm the man of the family now Father is away, and I shall buy them," said Joe. "Let's each get her something and not get anything for ourselves," said Beth. "That's a kind idea," said Joe. "What shall we get?" Everyone thought for a moment, then Meg said, "I'll give her a nice pair of gloves." "The best army slippers," said Joe. "Some handkerchiefs," said Beth. "A little bottle of perfume," said Amy. "It won't cost much, so I'll have some money left to buy something for me. We'll let Mother think we're getting things for ourselves, and then surprise her," said Joe. Mrs. March arrived home soon after. She took off her wet things and put on her warm slippers. Meg made the tea, Joe brought wood for the fire, Beth was quiet and busy, and Amy gave orders. "I've got a letter from Father," cried Mrs. March. It was a letter to cheer them up, and the special message for the girls came at the end. "Give them all my love and a kiss. I think of them every day. I know they will be loving children to you, and that when I come back, I will be prouder than ever of my little women." A tear dropped off the end of Joe's nose. Amy hid her face on her mother's shoulder. "I'm selfish," she cried, "but I'll try to be better." "We all will," cried Meg. "I think too much about the way I look and hate to work, but I won't any more. And I'll try to be a little woman," said Joe, "and not be rough and wild." Beth said nothing, but she began to work hard at a blue army glove she was making. So the four girls decided that they would all try very hard to be good. They would never be cross or lazy or selfish, and they would all help each other. They talked over their plan that evening, while they made sheets for Aunt March. Then at 9 o'clock they stopped to sing a song. Beth played the old piano, and Meg and her mother led the singing. Joe always sang in the wrong place, but the girls never got too old to sing together. Joe was the first to wake up on Christmas morning, but soon they were all awake and they went downstairs. "Where's Mother?" asked Meg. "I don't know," said old Hannah. She had lived with the family since Meg was born, and was more like a friend than a servant. "Some poor woman came to the door, and your mother went off to see what was needed. She'll be back soon," said Meg. She looked at the presents for her mother, which were in a basket under a chair, ready to bring out at the right time. "Where is Amy's bottle of perfume?" "She went to put some pretty paper round it, I think," said Joe. Suddenly they heard the outside door close. "Here's Mother. Hide the basket, quick," said Joe. But it was Amy. She came in quickly. "Where have you been, and what's that behind you?" asked Meg. "I ran to the shop and changed the little bottle of perfume for a big one," said Amy. "I spent all my money to get it, and I'm not going to be selfish any more." Meg smiled proudly and put her arms around her sister. Then there was another bang from the outside door, and the basket was pushed back under the chair. The girls ran to the table, ready for their breakfast. "Happy Christmas, Mother," they shouted. "Happy Christmas, little daughters," said Mrs. March. Then the smile disappeared from her face. "Girls, listen. Not far away is a poor woman, Mrs. Hummel, with a new baby. Her 6 children are in one bed, trying to keep warm, as they have no wood for a fire. There is nothing to eat, and they are hungry and cold. Will you give them your breakfast as a Christmas present?" For a minute no one spoke. Then Joe said, "Mother, I'm so glad you came back before we began to eat." And the girls quickly began to put their breakfast in a basket. "I knew you would do it," said Mrs. March, smiling. She took the girls and Hannah to a cold, miserable little room in an old building, where they found a sick mother, a crying baby, and a group of children with white, frightened faces. The children were on the bed under a blanket, trying to keep warm. The woman almost cried with happiness when she saw the girls. Hannah, who had brought wood, made a fire. Mrs. March gave the mother tea and hot food. Then she dressed the little baby gently. The girls put the children round the fire and fed them like hungry birds. It was a very happy meal, although the girls ate none of it. But no one was happier than those hungry young ladies who gave away their breakfast on Christmas morning. Mrs. March was surprised and pleased when she saw her presents later. There was a lot of laughing and kissing and explaining. Then, for the rest of the day, the girls were busy. Joe liked to write plays, and the 4 of them were going to act one that evening. They had learned their words and had worked hard to make strange and wonderful clothes for all the different characters in the play. On Christmas night, some other girls came to watch. At first, there was a lot of whispering and laughing from the 4 sisters behind the curtains. Then the curtains were opened and the play began. It was an exciting story about Hugo, acted by Joe wearing a black beard, beautiful Zara, and brave Roderigo. There were also 2 ghosts, a cruel king, and a tall castle made of paper and wood, which unfortunately fell down just as Roderigo and Zara were escaping from it. There were screams of laughter from everyone, but the actors picked themselves up and carried on through more dangers and mysteries until the happy ending was reached. All the visitors loved the play, and after the excitement and fun came a surprise for everyone. "Would the young ladies like to stay for supper?" asked Hannah. And when the girls saw the supper table, they could not believe their eyes. There was ice cream, cake, fruit, and French chocolate. And in the middle of the table were flowers for each of the 4 actors. "Where did it all come, Tom?" asked Amy. "From Father Christmas, perhaps," said Beth. "Mother did it," said Meg. "Aunt March sent it," said Joe. "You're all wrong," laughed Mrs. March. "Old Mr. Lawrence sent it." "The Lawrence boy's grandfather," said Meg. "But we don't know him. Hannah told us husband about your breakfast party, and that pleased him," said Mrs. March. "He knew my father many years ago, and he sent me a note this afternoon, asking if he could send my children a few small Christmas presents. The idea came from that boy." "I know it did," said Joe. "PM's sure he wants to know us, but he's shy, and Meg won't let me speak to him when we pass him in the street. She says that it's not at all polite for young ladies to introduce themselves to strangers." "You mean the people who live in the big house next door, don't you?" said one of the other girls. "My mother knows old Mr. Lawrence. She says he keeps his grandson in the house when the boy isn't riding or walking with his tutor, and makes him study very hard. We invited the boy to our party, but he didn't come." "That boy needs to have some fun," said Joe. "Look," said Meg excitedly a day or 2 later. She waved a piece of paper at Joe. "An invitation to a New Year's party at Sally Gardiner's house, and it's for both of us. Mother says we can go, but what shall we wear?" "Our best cotton dresses," said Joe, "because we haven't got anything else. Yours is as good as new, but mine has a burn and a hole in the back." "Then you must keep your back out of sight," said Meg. "I'll have a new ribbon for my hair, and my new slippers. And my gloves are all right. Mine are stained, so I'll have to go without." "You must wear gloves to a dance, Joe," cried Meg. "Then we'll each wear one good one and carry a bad one," said Joe. Meg looked worried. "All right, but you will behave nicely, won't you? Don't stare or put your hands behind your back." On New Year's Eve, the 2 younger sisters watched the 2 older girls get ready for the party. There was a lot of running up and down and laughing and talking. Meg wanted some curls around her face, so Joe began to work on the papered ends of Meg's hair with a pair of hot tongs. "Should they smoke like that?" asked Beth. "It's the wetness drying," said Joe. "What a strange burning smell," said Amy. "I'll take the papers off now," said Joe, "and you'll see lots of little curls." She took the papers off, and to her horror the burnt hair came off with them. "Oh, what have you done to my hair?" cried Meg. "I always get things wrong," said Joe unhappily. "I'm so sorry. I suppose the tongs were too hot." "Don't worry," Amy told Meg, who was crying. "Just tie your ribbon so that the ends come on to your forehead a little, and it will look quite fashionable." At last, Meg and Joe were ready and went off to the gardener's house, where Mrs. Gardiner welcomed them kindly. Meg immediately began to enjoy herself with Sally. But Joe wasn't interested in girlish talk and stood with her back carefully against the wall, watching the dancing. Soon Meg was asked to dance. Then Joe saw a big red-haired boy coming towards her, and she quickly went through a door into a small room. Unfortunately, another shy person was already hiding there, and she found herself looking at the Lawrence boy. "Oh dear, I didn't know anyone was here," Joe said. The boy laughed. "Don't go. I came in here because I don't know any people, but I think I've seen you before," he said. "You live near us, don't you?" "Next door," said Joe. "We enjoyed your nice Christmas present. My grandfather sent it, Miss March." "But you gave your grandfather the idea, didn't you, Mr. Lawrence?" "I'm not Mr. Lawrence, only Laurie," he said. "And I'm not Miss March, only Joe," she said. "Do you like parties?" "Sometimes," he answered. I've been abroad a lot recently, and I don't know how you do things here. Abroad, said Joe. Oh, did you go to Paris? We went there last winter. Can you speak French? She asked. He said something in French, and Joe listened carefully. You asked, who is the young lady in the pretty slippers? It's my sister Meg, and you knew it was. Do you think she's pretty? Yes, he said. She looks so fresh and quiet. This pleased Joe very much, and soon the two of them were talking easily, like old friends. I hear you're always studying hard, said Joe. Are you going to college soon? Not for a year or two, he said. I'm 16 next month, and I won't go before I'm 17. I wish I was going to college, said Joe. I hate even the idea of it, said Laurie. Joe wanted to know why, but he looked so serious that instead of asking, she said, Why don't you go and dance? I will if you'll come too, he answered. I can't because Joe stopped. Because what? You won't tell. Never. I've a bad habit of standing near a fire, and I burn my dresses, said Joe. I have to keep still so that no one will see the burn on this one. Laugh if you like. But Laurie didn't laugh. Never mind that, he said gently. Please come. Joe smiled. All right, she said. Thank you. When the music stopped, they sat down and began to talk, but Joe saw Meg waving at her. She went over and followed her sister into a side room. I've turned my foot over and hurt my ankle, said Meg. I can't walk on it, and I don't know how I'm going to get home. I'm not surprised you turned your foot over in those stupid high shoes, said Joe. You'll have to get a carriage or stay here all night. A carriage will cost a lot, said Meg, and I can't stay here for the night because the house is full. I'll just rest until Hannah comes to fetch us, then do the best I can. They're going in for supper now, said Joe. I'll stay with you. No, run and bring me some coffee, said Meg. Joe found the coffee, but immediately dropped some down the front of her dress. She was cleaning it off with Meg's glove when a friendly voice spoke to her. Can I help? Said Laurie. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and a plate with a cake on it in the other. I was trying to get something for Meg, said Joe. And I was looking for someone to give this to, he said. He fetched more coffee and a cake for Joe. Then the three of them had a happy time talking together until Hannah arrived. Meg completely forgot about her foot and stood up quickly. She cried out with pain, and when Laurie saw that she could not walk, he immediately offered to take them home in his grandfather's carriage. But you can't want to go home yet, said Joe. I always go early, said Laurie. He sat with the driver, and the two girls sat with Hannah inside the carriage and talked excitedly about the party. I had a wonderful time, did you? Said Joe. Yes, until I hurt myself, said Meg. Sally's friend Annie Moffat has asked me to go and stay with her for a week in the spring, when Sally does. Joe told Meg her adventures, and then they were home. They thanked Laurie and went quietly into the house, hoping to wake no one. But as soon as they opened their bedroom door, two little voices cried out, Tell us about the party. Tell us about the party. It's so nice to go to parties and drive home in carriages, said Meg, the next morning. Other people live like that all the time, and I wish we could. I wish we were rich. Well, we're not, said Joe. So we must do our work with a smile the way Mother does. Mr. March had lost most of his money helping a friend. When the two older girls discovered this, they wanted to do something to earn some money for the family, and as soon as they were old enough, they found work. Meg got a job teaching 4 small children. It was hard for her to be poor because she could remember the time when their home had been beautiful, with everything they wanted. And every day at Mrs. King's house she saw pretty dresses and heard talk of parties and the theater, all the things which Meg loved. Jo went to Aunt March, who needed someone to fetch and carry things, and read to her. She was a difficult old lady who complained a lot, but Jo did her best. Beth was much too shy to go to school with other children, so she studied at home with her father. When he went away, and her mother was busy with war work, Beth continued to study by herself and helped Hannah keep the home tidy for the others. She also spent long, quiet hours alone, talking to her dolls or playing the old piano. Beth loved music and, although the family could not afford music lessons or a good piano for her, she tried hard to make herself a better musician. Amy drew the most beautiful pictures and wanted to be a famous painter one day. She was a favorite with everyone, except when she complained about having to wear her cousin's old clothes because her mother could not afford to buy new ones for her. One afternoon a week or two later, Jo went outside to clear the snow away from some of the garden so that Beth could walk there when the sun came out. She looked across to the house next door, a big stone house with lovely things inside that Jo occasionally saw through the open curtains at the windows. But it seemed a lonely, lifeless kind of house, as no children played outside, no motherly face smiled at the windows, and not many people went in and out, except the old gentleman and his grandson. She had not seen the Lawrence boy lately and wondered if he was away, but suddenly she saw him looking out of an upstairs window. She threw up a handful of soft snow and called out, "Are you ill?" Laurie opened the window. "I'm almost better, thank you," he said. "I've had a bad cold." "What do you find to do?" said Jo. "Nothing," he said. "They won't let me." "Why don't you get someone to come and see you?" "I don't know anyone." "You know us," said Jo. "So I do," laughed Laurie. "Will you come, please?" "I'll come if Mother will let me." "I'll go and ask her." "Shut the window and wait until I come." Laurie was excited and began to get ready for Jo's visit. He brushed his hair and tried to make his room tidy. Soon after, he heard voices downstairs. Then a surprised servant ran up to his room. "There's a young lady to see you, sir," she said. A moment later, Jo appeared with a box in one hand and Beth's 3 small cats in the other. "Mother sends her love," she said. "Meg asked me to bring some of her cake, and Beth thought you would like to play with her cats. Isn't she funny?" Laurie laughed. "How kind you all are," he said. "Shall I read to you?" said Jo. "I'd rather talk," he said. "I can talk all day," said Jo, smiling. "Beth says I never know when to stop." "Is Beth the one who stays at home?" "Yes, that's Beth. She's a good girl. The pretty one is Meg, and the curly-haired one is Amy. Is that right?" he said. "Yes." "How did you know?" Laurie's face became red. "I hear you calling to each other, and you always seem to be having so much fun. Sometimes, in the evenings, you forget to close your curtains and I can see you sitting round the fire with your mother." "I haven't got a mother." Jo saw the sadness in his eyes. "Why don't you come over and see us? Would your grandfather let you?" "Perhaps if your mother asked him," said Laurie. "He spends a lot of time among his books and Mr. Brooke, my tutor, doesn't live here. So I haven't anyone to go out with." "Do you like your school?" "I don't go to school. I go out to work, to my aunt's," said Jo. She described the difficult old lady and made him laugh with her stories. She told him all about her sisters, the plays they acted, and their hopes and fears for their father. Then they talked about books, and Jo discovered that Laurie loved them as much as she did. "Come and see our library," he said. "Grandfather is out, so you needn't be afraid." "I'm not afraid of anything," replied Jo. He took her down to a room where the walls were covered with books and pictures. "You should be the happiest boy in the world," said Joe, sitting in a big armchair and looking round. "A person can't live on books," he said. Suddenly a bell rang. Joe jumped up out of the chair. "It's your grandfather," she said. "What if it is?" said Laurie with a smile. "You're not afraid of anything, remember?" "Perhaps I am a little bit afraid of," said Joe. The servant came in at that moment. "The doctor is here to see you, sir," she said to Laurie. "Can I leave you for a minute or two, Joe?" he said. "Yes, I'm very happy here," said Joe. He went away and Joe was staring at a large picture of the old gentleman when the door opened again. Without turning, she said, "I won't be afraid of him because he's got kind eyes, although his mouth looks hard and cold. He's not as handsome as my grandfather, but I like him." "Thank you," said a deep voice behind her. She turned quickly and saw old Mr. Lawrence. Joe's face turned a bright red, and she wanted to run away. But the old man's eyes looked kinder than those in the picture and seemed to have a smile in them. "So you're not afraid of me, eh?" he said. "Not much, sir." "But I'm not as handsome as your grandfather?" "Not quite, sir." "But you like me." He laughed and shook hands with her. "Now, what have you been doing with my grandson?" "Trying to cheer him up, sir," said Joe. "He seems a bit lonely." "Then come and have some tea with us." Laurie was very surprised to see Joe with his grandfather, but was soon talking and laughing happily with Joe. The old man watched the two young people and noticed the change in his grandson. "She's right," he thought. "The boy does need cheering up." After tea, they went into a room where there was a large and beautiful piano. "Do you play?" Joe asked Laurie. "Sometimes," he answered. "Play now. I want to hear it so I can tell Beth." So Laurie played and Joe listened. Afterwards, Mr. Lawrence said, "He plays quite well, but I want him to do well in more important things. Now, I hope you'll come again." He shook hands with her. "Good night, Joe." Laurie walked to the door with her. "He doesn't like to hear me play," he said. "Why not?" said Joe. "I'll tell you one day," he said. When Joe told the family of her afternoon's adventures, they all wanted to go and visit the big house. "Mother, why doesn't Mr. Lawrence like to hear Laurie play the piano?" asked Joe. "Laurie's father married an Italian lady, a musician," said Mrs. March. "The old man didn't like her and never saw his son after they were married. Laurie was born in Italy, but his parents died when he was a child, and his grandfather brought him home. Laurie loves music, and I expect his grandfather is afraid he'll want to be a musician like his mother." "Laurie should be a musician if he wants to be," said Joe. "Sending him to college will just make him unhappy." When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house, which no one save an old manservant, a combined gardener, and cook had seen in at least 10 years. It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. And now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names where they lay in the cedar-bemused cemetery among the ranked and anonymous graves of Union and Confederate soldiers who fell at the Battle of Jefferson. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor who fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. Only a man of Colonel Sartoris' generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. On the first of the year they mailed her a tax notice. February came, and there was no reply. They wrote her a formal letter, asking her to call at the sheriff's office at her convenience. A week later the mayor wrote her himself, offering to call or to send his car for her, and received in reply a note on paper of an archaic shape, in a thin, flowing calligraphy in faded ink, to the effect that she no longer went out at all. The tax notice was also enclosed, without comment. They called a special meeting of the Board of Aldermen. A deputation waited upon her, knocked at the door through which no visitor had passed since she ceased giving China painting lessons 8 or 10 years earlier. They were admitted by the old Negro into a dim hall from which a stairway mounted into still more shadow. It smelled of dust and disuse, a close, dank smell. The Negro led them into the parlor. It was furnished in heavy, leather-covered furniture. When the Negro opened the blinds of one window, they could see that the leather was cracked, and when they sat down, a faint dust rose sluggishly about their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sun ray. On a tarnished gilt easel before the fireplace stood a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. They rose when she entered, a small, fat woman in black, with a thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt, leaning on an ebony cane with a tarnished gold head. Her skeleton was small and spare. Perhaps that was why what would have been merely plumpness in another was obesity in her. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like two small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough as they moved from one face to another while the visitors stated their errand. She did not ask them to sit. She just stood in the door and listened quietly until the spokesman came to a stumbling halt. Then they could hear the invisible watch ticking at the end of the gold chain. Her voice was dry and cold. "I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris explained it to me. Perhaps one of you can gain access to the city records and satisfy yourselves. But we have. We are the city authorities, Miss Emily. Didn't you get a notice from the sheriff, signed by him?" "I received a paper, yes," Miss Emily said. "Perhaps he considers himself the sheriff. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But there is nothing on the books to show that. You see, we must go. See Colonel Sartoris. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But, Miss Emily, see Colonel Sartoris." Colonel Sartoris had been dead almost 10 years. "I have no taxes in Jefferson." "Tobe!" The Negro appeared. "Show these gentlemen out." So she vanquished them, horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. That was 2 years after her father's death, and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. After her father's death she went out very little. After her sweetheart went away, people hardly saw her at all. A few of the ladies had the temerity to call, but were not received, and the only sign of life about the place was the Negro man, a young man then going in and out with a market basket. Just as if any men could keep a kitchen properly, the ladies said. So they were not surprised when the smell developed. It was another link between the gross, teeming world and the high and mighty Griersons. A neighbor, a woman, complained to the mayor, Judge Stevens, 80 years old. "But what will you have me do about it, madam?" he said. "Why, send her word to stop it," the woman said. "Isn't there a law?" "I'm sure that won't be necessary," Judge Stevens said. "It's probably just a snake or a rat that of hers killed in the yard. I'll speak to him about it." The next day he received 2 more complaints, one from a man who came in diffident deprecation. "We really must do something about it, Judge. I'd be the last one in the world to bother Miss Emily, but we've got to do something." That night the Board of Aldermen met 3 graybeards and 1 younger man, a member of the rising generation. "It's simple enough," he said. "Send her word to have her place cleaned up. Give her a certain time to do it in, and if she don't—" "Damn it, sir," Judge Stevens said, "will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad?" So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there, and in all the outbuildings. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her, and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locusts that lined the street. After a week or 2 the smell went away. That was when people had begun to feel really sorry for her. People in our town, remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great-aunt, had gone completely crazy at last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau, Miss Emily a slender figure in white in the background, her father a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the 2 of them framed by the back-flung front door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. Even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all of her chances if they had really materialized. When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her, and in a way people were glad. At last they could pity Miss Emily. Being left alone and a pauper, she had become humanized. Now she too would know the old thrill and the old despair of a penny more or less. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid. As is our custom, Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual and with no trace of grief on her face. She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her, and the doctors trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. Just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down, and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl, with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks, and in the summer after her father's death they began the work. The construction company came with mules and machinery, and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ready man, with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss, and singing in time to the rise and fall of picks. Pretty soon he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. At first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, of course a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day laborer. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily. Her kinsfolk should come to her. She had some kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of old Lady Wyatt, the crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. And as soon as the old people said, poor Emily, the whispering began. Do you suppose it's really so? They said to one another. Of course it is. What else could? This behind their hands, rustling of craned silk and satin behind jalousies closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoon as the thin, swift clop-clop-clop of the matched team passed. Poor Emily. She carried her head high enough even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson, as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. Like when she bought the rat poison, the arsenic. That was over a year after they had begun to say, poor Emily, and while the two female cousins were visiting her. I want some poison, she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes and a face the flesh of which was strained across the temples and about the eye sockets as you imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. I want some poison, she said. Yes, Miss Emily. What kind? For rats and such? I want the best you have. I don't care what kind. The druggist named several. They'll kill anything up to an elephant. But what you want is arsenic, Miss Emily said. Is that a good one? Is arsenic? Yes, ma'am. But what you want? I want arsenic. The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. Why, of course, the druggist said. If that's what you want. But the law requires you to tell what you are going to use it for. Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye, until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. The Negro delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and bones, for rats. So the next day we all said, she will kill herself. And we said it would be the best thing. When she had first begun to be seen with Homer Barron, we had said, she will marry him. Then we said, she will persuade him yet, because Homer himself had remarked he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Later we said, poor Emily behind the jalousies as they passed on Sunday afternoon in the glittering buggy, Miss Emily with her head high and Homer Barron with his hat cocked and a cigar in his teeth, reins and whip in a yellow glove. Then some of the ladies began to say that it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister. Miss Emily's people were Episcopal to call upon her. He would never divulge what happened during that interview, but he refused to go back again. The next Sunday they again drove about the streets, and the following day the minister's wife wrote to Miss Emily's relations in Alabama. So she had bloodkin under her roof again, and we sat back to watch developments. At first nothing happened. Then we were sure that they were to be married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver, with the letters HB on each piece. 2 days later we learned that she had bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said, "They are married." We were really glad. We were glad because the 2 female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily had ever been. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron the Streets had been finished some time since was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming, or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. By that time it was a cabal, and we were all Miss Emily's allies to help circumvent the cousins. Sure enough, after another week they departed. And, as we had expected all along, within 3 days Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. The Negro man went in and out with the market basket, but the front door remained closed. Now and then we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the lime, but for almost 6 months she did not appear on the streets. Then we knew that this was to be expected too, as if that quality of her father which had thwarted her woman's life so many times had been too virulent and too furious to die. When we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat, and her hair was turning gray. During the next few years it grew grayer and grayer, until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray, when it ceased turning. Up to the day of her death at 74 it was still that vigorous iron gray, like the hair of an active man. From that time on her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years, when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in China painting. She fitted up a studio in one of the downstairs rooms, where the daughters and granddaughters of Colonel Sartoris' contemporaries were sent to her with the same regularity and in the same spirit that they were sent to church on Sundays with a 25-cent piece for the collection plate. Meanwhile her taxes had been remitted. Then the newer generation became the backbone and the spirit of the town, and the painting pupils grew up and fell away, and did not send their children to her with boxes of color and tedious brushes and pictures cut from the ladies' magazines. The front door closed upon the last one, and remained closed for good. When the town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. Daily, monthly, yearly we watched the Negro grow grayer and more stooped, going in and out with the market basket. Each December we sent her a tax notice, which would be returned by the post office a week later, unclaimed. Now and then we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house like the carven torso of an idol in a niche. Looking or not looking at us, we could never tell which. Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And so she died, fell ill in the house filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering Negro man to wait on her. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to get any information from the Negro. He talked to no one, probably not even to her, for his voice had grown harsh and rusty, as if from disuse. She died in one of the downstairs rooms, in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her gray head propped on a pillow yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight. The Negro met the first of the ladies at the front door and let them in, with their hushed, sibilant voices and their quick, curious glances, and then he disappeared. He walked right through the house and out the back, and was not seen again. The two female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the second day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers, with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier, and the ladies sibilant and macabre, and the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms on the porch and the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression, as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but, instead, a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust. A thin, acrid pall as of the tomb seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal. Upon the valance curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal and the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver. Silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and tie, as if they had just been removed, which, lifted, left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit carefully folded, beneath it the two mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in the bed. For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay. And upon him and upon the pillow beside him lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron-gray hair.